He was 52 years old, and he had never lost a ship. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura had commanded destroyers at the Battle of the Java Sea. He had won. He had commanded destroyers at Guadalcanal. He had survived. And on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, standing on the bridge of his flagship in the middle of the Bismarck Sea, he lifted his binoculars, and for the first time in 26 years of naval service, he could not breathe. 12 American bombers were coming at him at 30 feet above the water. He had 90 seconds to live as an admiral. He didn't know it yet. 2,000 miles away, his enemy, a 40-year-old American woman named Papy Gun, was standing in a soup line inside a Japanese prison camp in Manila. She had not seen her husband in 452 days. She had 4 hungry children beside her. She did not know it, but at this exact moment, her husband's invention was 1,500 yards from Admiral Kimura's bridge, and 8 muzzles were about to open fire. To understand how 8 machine guns ended up on the nose of an American medium bomber flying 30 feet above the Bismarck Sea, we have to go back 16 months to an office in Brisbane, Australia, and to a problem no one in the United States Army Air Forces could solve. The problem had a name, the B-25 Mitchell. On paper, the B-25 was a good aircraft, 2 Wright Cyclone engines, a top speed of 272 miles per hour, a bomb bay capable of carrying 3,000 pounds. It had already flown into history 1 year earlier, when 16 of them lifted off the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo in the Doolittle raid. In America, the B-25 was a symbol of vengeance. In the South Pacific, in the summer of 1942, it was a symbol of frustration. Because the B-25 could not hit ships, the doctrine was simple: fly at 6,000 feet, fly at 8,000 feet, fly at 10,000 feet, line up the target through the Norden bomb site, release, and watch the bombs fall for 18 seconds while a Japanese destroyer, warned by the sound of engines minutes earlier, turned 30 degrees to port and slid out of the impact zone. The Japanese knew. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding the destroyer Amatsukaze, later wrote what every skipper in the Imperial Navy understood by the middle of that summer. The American bombers were like mosquitoes. Loud, persistent, harmless. Then, in August of 1942, Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenny arrived in Brisbane. Kenny was 53 years old, 5'6", barrel-chested, cigar in his mouth at all hours. He walked into the 5th Air Force headquarters, read the mission reports for 6 days, and then said something to his staff that no one who was in the room ever forgot. "We have more airplanes than the Japanese have ships, and we're not hitting a damn thing." He sent his first request to Washington within 48 hours. He wanted A-20 Havoc attack bombers. Purpose-built, fast, heavily armed, perfect for low-altitude, anti-shipping strikes. Washington's answer came back in 3 weeks. No, every A-20 in production was going to Europe. Every strategic priority pointed at Germany. The Southwest Pacific was, in the language of the War Department, a secondary theater. Kenny did not argue. He sat in his office in Brisbane, alone, and he began to read. He read Royal Air Force reports from the North Atlantic. He read about a technique the British had been experimenting with against German U-boats. Bombs skipped across the water surface like flat stones on a pond. He read the reports from RF Coastal Command, from Bristol Beaufort squadrons, from anti-submarine crews who had watched their skip bombs bounce twice, 3 times, and detonate against the hull of a surfaced submarine. And he saw something no one else had seen. The technique worked, but the aircraft delivering it had no way to suppress return fire. That was why the British had shelved it. Kenny closed the folder. He looked at the wall map of the Southwest Pacific. He looked at the reference photograph of a B-25 Mitchell pinned above his desk, and he asked himself a question that would change the Pacific War. What if you could build a bomber that carried enough forward firepower to suppress a ship's anti-aircraft guns, and then skip-bomb the target at wave-top height? There was no such aircraft in the world. No factory built one. No engineer had designed one. No Air Force had ever asked for one. But there was a man in a hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield, 40 minutes outside Brisbane, who might be crazy enough to try. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn. Everyone called him Pappy. He was 43 years old. He had a face like weathered leather. He had been a chief petty officer in the United States Navy for 20 years before retiring to Manila in 1937 to run Philippine Airlines. He had a wife named Polly. He had 4 children, Nath, Julie, Connie, and Paul Jr. And on December 8, 1941, when Japanese aircraft bombed Clark Field, he had been in the air on a business flight. He had never made it home. His family had been rounded up, marched into Santo Tomas internment camp in the middle of Manila, and they had been there for 11 months. Papy Gun had one job now: kill Japanese. He had been given the rank of major without ever attending an officer's academy. He was, by every conventional measure, the wrong man to modify a combat aircraft. He was not an aeronautical engineer. He had never studied airframe stress dynamics. His workshop at Eagle Farm was a corrugated iron shed with an oil-stained floor, 3 toolboxes, and a welding torch. In November of 1942, Kenny drove out to meet him. Standing beside Kenny was Jack Fox, a field service representative from North American Aviation, the company that had built the B-25. Fox was in his early 40s, a professional engineer. He had been sent to Australia to advise on maintenance. What happened in the next 15 minutes was not in his job description. Kenny explained the problem. He explained the idea. He asked one question: can you put 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose of a B-25? Gunn looked at the aircraft parked 20 feet away. He looked at Fox. He said one word: yes. Fox turned pale. He tried to explain politely that the nose of a B-25 was not structurally designed to absorb the recoil forces of 4 Browning M2 machine guns firing in synchronization, that the airframe would flex, that the sight glass would shatter, that the center of gravity would shift dangerously forward. He listed 6 reasons the modification was impossible. Gunn listened. Then he walked to the aircraft, opened a toolbox, and picked up the welding torch. That was how the Strafer program was born. Not in a boardroom, not in a design lab. In a corrugated iron shed in Eastern Australia, between a 53-year-old general with no aircraft to spare, a 43-year-old ex-Navy pilot whose family was starving in a Japanese prison camp, and a factory representative who was quietly writing his resignation letter in his head. But the Strafer program almost did not survive its first month. Because when Kenny flew back to headquarters and formally requested that Colonel John Big Jim Davies, commander of the 3rd Attack Group, the unit that would have to fly these modified aircraft, authorize field conversion of his B-25 fleet, Davies refused. Davies was a professional soldier. West Point graduate, career pilot, Distinguished Flying Cross recipient. He had driven out to Eagle Farm to inspect Papy Gun's work, and what he had seen alarmed him. Gun was cutting into structural bulkheads. Gun was adding weight without engineering calculations. Gun was, in Davies' precise language, a civilian tinkerer with a welding torch. Davies filed a written objection to 5th Air Force headquarters. He recommended the program be terminated. He warned that pilots would die in aircraft that broke apart under stress. Kenny read the objection. Then he flew to Davies' headquarters in person and delivered a message that was never written down, but that Davies remembered for the rest of his life. You will authorize this program, or I will find a colonel who will. The Strafer program lived. 3 months later, 12 of Papy Gun's modified B-25 Mitchells lifted off from a dirt airstrip near Port Moresby, banked north over the Owen-Stanley Range, and began flying toward a Japanese convoy commanded by Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura in the middle of the Bismarck Sea. The world was about to change. The workshop at Eagle Farm did not look like a place where empires died. It was 90 feet long, 60 feet wide, and roofed in corrugated iron that turned the interior into an oven by 10 in the morning. The floor was packed, earth-stained black with engine oil. 3 workbenches lined the western wall. A hoist system, rigged from scrap chain and salvaged pulleys, could lift a B-25 engine 6 feet off the ground. There were no blueprints on the walls. There were no engineering diagrams. There was one Coca-Cola calendar from 1941, still turned to December, still showing a red-cheeked Santa Claus that no one had bothered to update. This was where Papy Gun worked. He arrived at 5 in the morning. He stayed until midnight. He slept on a cot in a supply room next to the paint locker. Jack Fox, the North American aviation representative who had tried to talk him out of the modifications in November, was now his shadow, because Fox had realized somewhere in the second week that the crazy old man was going to succeed, and Fox wanted to be there when it happened. The first problem was recoil. A Browning M250 caliber machine gun fires 850 rounds per minute. Each round leaves the muzzle at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Every shot pushes backward against the airframe. 4 guns firing together, then 8. After Gun added the package guns to the fuselage sides, created a stress load the nose of a B-25 had never been designed to absorb. The first test firing tore 3 rivets clean out of the nose section. Gun cut a strip of 1/4-inch steel plate. He hand-formed it into a U-channel. He welded the channel to the internal frame of the nose bay, running it fore and aft, tying the recoil loads directly into the wing spar carry-through. He fired again. The nose held. He noted the modification on the back of an envelope. He moved on. The second problem was balance. 8 machine guns weighed roughly 500 pounds. Ammunition, 3,200 rounds at approximately 2 ounces per round, weighed another 400 pounds. Add the reinforcement steel, add the ammunition feed tracks. The center of gravity of a fully loaded Strafer B-25 was now measurably forward of the design specification. The aircraft was nose-heavy. In a dive, it wanted to keep diving. In a stall, it wanted to spin. Gun removed the belly turret. He shifted the auxiliary fuel tank aft by 4 feet. He calculated on the back of another envelope that this brought the center of gravity back within acceptable range. Jack Fox, who did have an engineering degree, checked the math. The math was correct. The third problem was ammunition. Each gun held 400 rounds, 8 guns, 3,200 rounds total. At a combined rate of 6,800 rounds per minute, a Strafer B-25 could empty every gun in 28 seconds. 28 seconds of continuous fire. That was the entire combat load. After that, the aircraft was a target. Gun accepted this. He designed the trigger system so that the pilot could fire in short bursts, 1 second on, 1 second off, extending the effective combat window to nearly 2 minutes. He also added a master switch that allowed our pilot to fire selective guns. 4 guns for suppression, 8 guns for kill shots. It was, in the language of a later war, weapons discipline. But no one called it that in 1942. They just called it not running out too fast. By the end of January 1943, the first fully modified Strafer B-25 was ready for combat evaluation. It was, at that moment, the most heavily armed, forward-firing aircraft in the world. But guns alone would not sink ships. For that, Kenny needed the second half of the equation, and the man who had built the second half was already dead. His name was William Garnett Benn, Major, United States Army Air Forces, 32 years old, commander of the 63rd Bomb Squadron of the 43rd Bombardment Group. In October of 1942, flying a B-17 Flying Fortress out of Port Moresby, Ben had done something that no one else in the Pacific had done. He had taken a 500-pound bomb, set the fuse for a 5-second delay, and dropped it from 200 feet above the water at 250 miles per hour. The bomb had skipped. It had bounced once off the wave crest. Then again. Then it had struck the side of a Japanese freighter in Rabaul Harbor, penetrated the hull below the waterline, and exploded inside the engine room. Ben had refined the technique through November and December. He had trained pilots on the wreck of the SS Pruth, a merchant vessel that had run aground on a reef near Port Moresby in 1923 and remained visible above the water. Pilots practiced approach angles, release heights, drop timing. By January of 1943, the technique was reliable enough to teach. On January 18, 1943, Major William Benn took off from Port Moresby on a reconnaissance flight over the northern coast of New Guinea. He never came back. No wreckage was found. No radio call was received. The father of skip bombing in the Pacific vanished 6 weeks before the technique he had invented would sink an Imperial Japanese division. He never knew what he had built. The command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, the unit that would fly Papy Gun's Strafer B-25s into combat, went to Major Edward Lana. Lana was 29 years old, 6 feet tall, sharp-jawed, married. 2 young daughters back in Roswell, New Mexico. He had a reputation, even among fellow combat pilots, as a man who did not know the meaning of the word caution. His trademark maneuver was a low-level chandelle, a diving pass over an airstrip followed by an aggressive climbing turn that he performed on nearly every landing. Some pilots called it showboating, others called it what it was: reckless. Lana did not care. He believed that a squadron commander who would not do what he asked his men to do was not a commander at all. He flew the lead aircraft on every practice mission. He flew it at 50 feet. He flew it at 30 feet. When his co-pilot warned him about the danger of hitting a wave crest at 280 miles per hour, Lana replied with a sentence that his crew remembered for the rest of their lives: "If I hit the water, you'll be dead before you know it." His personal B-25 was called Spook 2. The name was for his wife. Training was brutal. At Charters Towers, north of Brisbane, Lana's pilots practiced skip-bombing runs against wooden target rafts, anchored in shallow water. The margin for error was almost nothing. A pilot who released too high missed the target by 50 feet. A pilot who released too low was killed by his own bomb bouncing back into his engine. In early February 1943, 2 crews were lost during training accidents. One aircraft struck a mast on a supply barge that had drifted into the target range. The other stalled on pull-up and cartwheeled into the water. There were no survivors from either crash. Lana attended both memorial services. Then he ordered the training to continue. By the 3rd week of February, the 90th Bombardment Squadron had 12 fully modified Strafer B-25s and 48 combat-qualified aircrew. And Colonel Big Jim Davies, the same Big Jim Davies who 3 months earlier had tried to shut down the Strafer program, walked into General Kenny's office in Brisbane and requested that the entire 3rd Attack Group be converted to the Strafer configuration. Kenny asked him one question: "What changed your mind?" Davies answered with 3 words: "I watched Lana." He had flown as an observer on a routine anti-shipping strike against a small Japanese cargo vessel off Cape Ward Hunt. He had watched Lana's B-25 come out of the sun at 30 feet, tear the ship's superstructure apart in an 8-second gun run, and skip a bomb into its hull at the waterline. The ship had broken in half in 90 seconds. Davies had never seen a medium bomber do anything like it. He had never believed a medium bomber could. He was now the Strafer program's most aggressive advocate. The conversion of the full 3rd Attack Group was completed on approximately February 20th, 1943, 11 days before the Bismarck Sea. But the Japanese had already been warned. In late January, during one of the 90th Squadron's earliest combat sorties against shipping in Waiwak Harbor, a Japanese naval officer aboard a small transport had survived a Strafer attack. He had watched a B-25 come in at mast height. He had watched its nose flash with 8 simultaneous muzzles. He had watched half his crew die in 12 seconds, and when he was picked up by a passing Japanese destroyer, he wrote a report. The report went to the Imperial Navy staff at Rabaul. The report described, in precise language, a new American aircraft. A medium bomber configured with multiple heavy machine guns in the nose, firing continuously during a low-level approach, delivering bombs that skipped across the water. The report was read. The report was filed. The report was classified as unreliable, on the assessment that the surviving officer had been in a state of shock and had likely exaggerated. Standard Imperial Japanese Navy anti-aircraft doctrine remained unchanged. 6 weeks later, 6,900 men would die because of that decision. By the 3rd week of February, Allied Signals Intelligence at Central Bureau in Brisbane had cracked open the Japanese naval message traffic surrounding what the Imperial Japanese Army called Operation Number 81. Operation 81 was a resupply and reinforcement convoy. Its destination, the port on the northern coast of New Guinea, where Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi's 18th Army was under increasing pressure from Australian ground forces and Allied airstrikes. Its cargo was the 51st Infantry Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano. Its escort was Destroyer Squadron 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, flying his flag on the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy consisted of 8 troop and supply transports: Kyokusei Maru, Teo Maru, Ayo Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Kembu Maru, and the Naval Special Service vessel Nojima. Kembu Maru was loaded with aviation gasoline for a planned Japanese air offensive over New Guinea. Nojima carried 400 Special Naval Landing Force Marines. The other 6 vessels carried 6,000 soldiers of the 51st Division. The escort force consisted of 8 destroyers: Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo, every one of them a veteran of Guadalcanal, every one of them commanded by an officer who had fought and won at Savo Island and Tasafaronga. This was not a second-line escort. This was the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer force. Aboard Tokitsukaze was General Adachi himself. He had chosen to sail with the convoy to personally supervise the reinforcement. The Japanese planners knew the operation was dangerous. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the 8th Fleet at Rabaul, warned Imperial General Headquarters that Allied air power in the region had grown substantially since January. He recommended postponement at minimum until weather conditions provided cloud cover for the transit. Tokyo overruled him. Leh could not wait. The convoy would sail. Kimura received his final briefing on February 27th. He was 52 years old. He had commanded destroyers at the Battle of the Java Sea. He had won. He had commanded destroyers at Guadalcanal. He had survived. He was, by every professional measure, one of the finest destroyer commanders in the Imperial Navy. And after the briefing, according to his staff officer, he sat alone in his cabin aboard Shirayuki for 2 hours before returning to duty. He had not asked for postponement. He had not protested. He was a naval officer. He would sail. Just after midnight, on March 1st, 1943, the convoy cleared Simpson Harbor at Rabaul and turned west along the northern coast of New Britain. Kenny's staff had been waiting for that signal for 10 days. At Port Moresby, the crews of the 3rd Attack Group were briefed on a scale model. A sand table had been constructed on the airstrip with 16 wooden blocks representing the Japanese convoy in precise formation. Larner walked his pilots through the attack sequence 3 times. B-17s at 7,000 feet would draw the anti-aircraft fire. Australian Bristol Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, would strafe at mast height from one side, simulating a torpedo attack profile that would cause the Japanese ships to turn broadside. The Strafer B-25s of the 90th Squadron would come in from the opposite side at 30 feet into ships that had turned to present their broadest and softest silhouette. It was a coordinated ambush. Every element was calculated. Every timing was rehearsed. Kimura was sailing into a trap set by men who knew his course, his speed, his cargo, his composition, and his weakness. On the afternoon of March 2nd, a United States Army Air Force's B-24 Liberator, on scheduled patrol, sighted the convoy through a break in the clouds. Within 90 minutes, a strike of B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group was inbound. From 10,000 feet, they dropped a pattern of 500-pound bombs across the convoy formation. Most of the bombs missed. But one struck the transport Kyokusei Maru. She burned for 6 hours. Then she rolled onto her side and she sank. Roughly 700 soldiers of the 51st Division went down with her. Many more were pulled from the water by the destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze. It was, by any measure, a serious loss. Kimura believed it was the end of the attack. He believed the American bombers, having taken their shot from altitude, would return to base to refuel and rearm. He believed the convoy could reach Leh by the following night. He ordered the surviving destroyers to close ranks around the transports. He ordered the anti-aircraft gunners to stand down from full alert. He allowed his men to sleep in shifts. 12 hours later, at 9:58, on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of Shirayuki and lifted his binoculars toward 12 black shapes on the horizon. They were American B-25 Mitchells. They were not climbing. The 12 B-25 Mitchells of the 90th Bombardment Squadron were flying at 900 feet. Then Lana tipped his wing, and Spook 2 dropped toward the water. Behind him, in echelon formation, 11 more Strafer B-25s followed. They descended together, a coordinated dive that took them from 900 feet to 200 feet in 14 seconds. At 200 feet, they leveled off. At 100 feet, they leveled again. And then Lana pushed the yoke forward one more time, and Spook 2 settled at 30 feet above the waves. The propellers of the Mitchells threw twin curtains of spray behind them. They were now below the horizon line of the convoy. Aboard Shirayuki, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura had lifted his binoculars to check the high-altitude bombers, the B-17s of the 43rd Bomb Group, which were now visible at 7,000 feet, angling in for another attack run from the northeast. Every anti-aircraft gun in the convoy swung upward. Every gunner's eyes tracked the four-engined shapes overhead. Every fire control officer aboard every destroyer began calculating altitude, lead, and deflection. They were looking up, because they were supposed to look up, because a medium bomber attacking at 7,000 feet was a threat every Japanese naval officer had been trained to counter, because a formation of B-17s dropping through overcast was a familiar problem with a familiar solution, because the Imperial Japanese Navy had been fighting this exact kind of aerial attack for 14 months, and they had learned how to survive it. They were looking up. They were not looking down. Down was where Wing Commander Brian Blackjack, Walker's Australian Bristol Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, were coming in. The Beaufighter was a British-designed heavy fighter. Twin engines, 4 20mm Hispano cannons in the belly, 6.303 machine guns in the wings. It flew at 300 miles per hour at 0 feet. And on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, 13 of them came out of the low sun from the northwest, so close to the water that their exhaust flames trailed white steam behind them. The Japanese lookouts saw them at 8,000 yards. They screamed a warning. The bridge officers of the 8 Japanese destroyers reacted the way they had been trained to react. They saw twin-engined aircraft at 0 feet, closing at high speed, on a straight-in approach. They saw the classic profile of a torpedo bomber attack, and they gave the order that Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine demanded in that exact circumstance. Turn broadside. Present the narrowest possible target to the torpedoes. Every ship in the convoy turned. Every ship in the convoy exposed its entire flank to the sea in a direction 90 degrees away from the actual threat. Because there were no torpedoes. The Beaufighters had no torpedoes. They had cannons. They had machine guns. They came in low, and they opened fire at 1,500 yards, and their 20mm Hispano rounds began stitching the length of the Japanese destroyers, ripping through anti-aircraft positions, shattering bridge windows, and setting fire to ready-use ammunition lockers on the exposed decks. But the bowfighters were not the killers. The bowfighters were the distraction, and 30 seconds behind them, from the opposite direction, came Spook 2. Lana picked his target from 4,000 yards out. He saw the destroyer Shirayuki broadside on the water, exactly where he wanted her, exactly the way Kenny had promised him she would be. He saw the muzzles of her 25mm cannons, still pointed at the sky, still tracking the B-17s at 7,000 feet, still fighting the wrong battle. He saw her bridge crew, small dark shapes at that distance, moving with what looked like normal urgency, unaware that the actual attack was 15 seconds away. Lana armed his gun switches. He set the master selector to all 8. He pushed the throttles forward until the airspeed indicator touched 285 miles per hour. At 1,500 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The nose of Spook 2 vanished into a wall of fire. 8 Browning M2 machine guns, firing in synchronization, produced a signature that no Japanese officer had ever seen from a B-25 before. It was not a series of individual muzzle flashes. It was a continuous white burn, 3 feet long, extending from the nose of the aircraft like the flame of a cutting torch. And behind that light came the sound, not the rattle of individual guns. A single, continuous roar, nearly 7,000 rounds per minute, a sound like us cutting through steel. The rounds crossed the 1,500 yards in 1.5 seconds. They struck the bridge of Shirayuki at a rate of more than 100 rounds per second. The bridge windows exploded inward. The rangefinder disintegrated. The signal flag locker shattered into splinters. Lieutenant Commander Rokuru Sugawara, commanding officer of the destroyer, was killed instantly by armor-piercing incendiary rounds that passed through him and through the steel plating behind him without slowing. His navigator died beside him. His gunnery officer died at the fire control position. Every man on the bridge of Shirayuki, standing or sitting, was dead within 4 seconds. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura had been standing at the port bridge wing. A round struck him in the shoulder. A second grazed his thigh. He was thrown backwards onto the deck, bleeding, conscious, and unable to give an order, because there was no one left alive on his bridge to give an order to. Lana held the trigger down for 8 full seconds. Then he released the guns, and he released his bombs. 2 500-pound bombs left the belly of Spook 2 at an altitude of 180 feet, at a speed of 280 miles per hour. They struck the water 40 feet short of Shirayuki. They skipped once. They rose. They struck the destroyer's hull at the waterline, 1 bomb amidships, 1 bomb aft. The 5-second delay fuses did what they had been designed to do. The bombs exploded inside the ship. The stern of Shirayuki lifted 6 feet out of the water and then dropped. Steel plates buckled outward. The rear ammunition magazine did not detonate, a small mercy, but the after engine room flooded in 90 seconds. Shirayuki lost power, lost steering, and began to settle by the stern. Behind Lana, the rest of the 90th Squadron was already selecting targets. A B-25 named Chatterbox, tail number 41-13088, picked the destroyer Arashio. She came in at 40 feet. Her 8 guns opened fire at 1,400 yards, walking a continuous stream of armor-piercing rounds across Arashio's bridge, across her forward gun mount, across her port anti-aircraft battery. 3 500-pound bombs left her belly in sequence. 1 struck the water, short, and skipped over. 2 struck the destroyer directly. Her rudder was blown into an unresponsive angle. Out of control at 25 knots, Arashio veered hard to starboard, and she plowed at full speed into the port side of the transport Nojima. The 2 ships locked together and began to burn. Nojima's captain and most of her bridge crew were dead within 1 minute. 400 Special Naval Landing Force Marines, men who had been sitting on her hatch covers, watching the Beaufighter attack, believing themselves safe from air attack because they were on a naval vessel, were now trapped between Arashio's burning superstructure and Nojima's own aviation fuel stores below. Captain John Hennebury, flying the No. 3 aircraft in the formation, targeted the transport Teo Maru. Hennebury was 24 years old. He had joined the squadron 6 months earlier. He came in at 35 feet. He opened fire at 1,200 yards. And what happened to Teo Maru was what was happening across the entire convoy. A systematic, methodical, industrial destruction that no naval officer aboard those ships had ever imagined possible. Because the Japanese defensive doctrine had no answer. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners needed several seconds to swing their 25-millimeter cannons down from the high-altitude bombers to the wave-top attackers. They did not have several seconds. The Strafer B-25s were on top of their targets in 4. The gun crews who tried to swing their weapons down from the sky were killed by 50-caliber fire before they could complete the traverse. The gun crews, who had already been at low elevation, engaging the Beaufighters, were killed from the opposite direction by aircraft they never saw coming. Aboard Tokitsukaze, Commander Masayoshi Motokura watched his forward 25mm crew disintegrate in front of him. He turned to give an order. The next burst of 50-caliber fire came through the bridge screen and killed him where he stood. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, the commander of the entire 18th Army, was on Tokitsukaze at that moment, in the wardroom below the bridge. He survived because he was below deck. The men above him did not. Aboard the destroyer Asashio, Lieutenant Commander Yoshi Goru was on the bridge. 2 skip bombs from a B-25, whose pilot was never conclusively identified, struck Asashio at the boiler rooms. She sank so quickly with all hands that no witness survived to describe what happened on her bridge in her final minutes. Every man aboard was lost. Aboard the transport Oigawa Maru, the captain made the fatal decision to turn the ship broadside toward the incoming strafers, believing he could offer smaller anti-aircraft targets by presenting the length of the vessel. It was the opposite of what he should have done. Lieutenant Donald McCullough, flying a B-25 named Sleepy Time Gal, came in at 30 feet from the newly exposed flank. His 8 guns opened fire at 1,500 yards. His armor-piercing incendiary rounds entered Oigawa Maru's cargo holds, where ammunition and fuel were stored for the 51st Division, and detonated the entire aft third of the ship. Oigawa Maru broke in half. She sank in 90 seconds. 1,500 men went with her. Aboard Kembu Maru, the small transport carrying aviation gasoline, the first Strafer pass ignited every drum on the deck. She became a torch on the water. The heat from her burning aviation gasoline was visible from every ship in the convoy. She was gone in 3 minutes. The attack lasted 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, the American Strafer squadrons and the Australian Beaufighters killed a Japanese division. When Lana pulled Spook 2 up through 800 feet at the end of his second pass, he looked back over his left shoulder. He saw 7 columns of black smoke rising from what had been 8 transport ships. He saw 4 destroyers burning or already going down. He saw the ocean for 3 miles in every direction, covered in oil, wreckage, and men. He turned Spook 2 toward Port Moresby. He did not speak on the radio. The final act was the most difficult. At 11 that morning, General Kenny received the strike report. He also received a piece of intelligence he had been expecting. Japanese submarines had been dispatched from Rabaul to rescue survivors. If those survivors reached Lae, they would still be soldiers. 6,000 potential reinforcements. Enough to change the tactical balance in New Guinea for months. Kenny ordered the Strafer squadrons to return. He ordered them to attack the survivors in the water. The order was distributed to the pilots at Port Moresby that afternoon. Some pilots followed it. Some pilots did not. The historical record shows that the strafing of survivors did occur. It also shows that many pilots deliberately opened fire high or wide, hitting empty water instead of men. The order was legal under the rules of war as they existed in 1943, on the reasoning that soldiers being transported to a combat zone remained combatants regardless of the vessel that had carried them. It was also, for many of the men who received it, the hardest order of their lives. Kenny never apologized for giving it. He wrote, decades later, that he would give the same order again. By nightfall on March 4th, the last of the sinking Japanese vessels had gone under. The final count was 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk. Of the 6,900 soldiers of the 51st Division, only about 1,200 eventually reached Lae, most of them rescued from the water by the surviving destroyers Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo, or by the submarines and I-26 later that week. Nearly 3,000 men were dead. Ships, cargo, ammunition, aviation fuel, all of it at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Allied losses were 4 aircraft and 13 men. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, still bleeding from his shoulder wound, was transferred from the sinking Shirayuki to the destroyer Shikinami. He survived. He would command lesser assignments for the remainder of the war. He never publicly discussed what had happened on his bridge that morning. He died in 1960. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the report of the Bismarck Sea disaster at his flagship at Truk, his aide, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, later recalled that the commander-in-chief understood the strategic implication immediately. Japan could no longer protect its ships. Not with escorts, not with fighter cover, not with anti-aircraft doctrine. Everything they had assumed about aerial defense at sea was now obsolete. He was correct. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, issued a classified fleet-wide directive within 72 hours. Surface transport vessels were forbidden from operating within 500 nautical miles of any American land-based airfield. Reinforcement of forward garrisons would henceforth be conducted by submarine and by high-speed destroyer runs at night. The strategic capacity of these methods was less than 1/10 that of surface convoys. Japan's ability to sustain its empire, from Rabaul to the Solomons to New Guinea, collapsed in that single directive. Leh was abandoned in September of 1943. The men who had been meant to reinforce it walked out of the jungle 6 months later, starving, sick, and defeated, without having fought a single serious battle. The garrison at Buna died in place. The garrison at Salamaua died in place. Rabaul itself, the great fortress of the Imperial Japanese South Pacific, was cut off, bypassed, and left to starve. None of this had been accomplished by battleships, none of it by aircraft carriers, none of it by strategic bombing. It had been accomplished by a medium bomber with 8 machine guns in the nose, designed on the back of an envelope by a 43-year-old ex-Navy pilot in a corrugated iron shed in Australia. Major William Benn, the inventor of skip bombing, never knew. Major Edward Larner, the man who had flown Spook 2 into history, would not know for long. On April 30th, 1943, 58 days after the Bismarck Sea, Larner attempted his trademark landing chandelle at the airstrip at Dobodura. His aircraft was loaded with 8 passengers, full fuel, and 2,000 pounds of bombs. As he pulled up, the aircraft stalled. It entered a flat spin at 300 feet. It struck the ground and exploded. There were no survivors. Larner was 29 years old. He left behind his wife and his 2 daughters in Roswell, New Mexico. Captain John Hennebury assumed command of the 90th Squadron. The B-25 Strafer program continued. By late 1943, the 345th Bombardment Group, the Air Apaches, was flying Strafer B-25s across the entire Southwest Pacific. On November 2, 1943, 75 Strafer Mitchells struck Simpson Harbor at Rabaul in 12 minutes and effectively ended the port's usefulness as a Japanese naval base. In August of 1943, Strafer B-25s destroyed approximately 170 Japanese aircraft on the ground at Wewak in a 4-day series of raids. North American Aviation eventually incorporated Papy Gun's field modifications into factory production. The B-25H model carried a 75mm cannon plus 4 50-caliber machine guns in the nose. The B-25J-22 model carried 12 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. Approximately 10,000 B-25s were built during the Second World War. Nearly 40% of them were Strafer variants. Every one of them traced back to a corrugated iron shed at Eagle Farm. On February 3, 1945, the 1st Cavalry Division of the United States Army broke through the walls of Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Papy Gun was severely malnourished. Her 4 children were malnourished, but alive. They had been prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army for 3 years, 1 month, and 27 days. Papy Gun, now Lieutenant Colonel Paul Gun, flew into Manila in an L-5 Sentinel liaison aircraft during the first week of the liberation. He had permission from General Kenny to leave his post immediately. He landed on a strip of road cleared by combat engineers. He walked into what remained of the camp, and he found his wife and his children. His youngest son had been 8 years old when the war began. He was now 11. He had lived 1/4 of his life without his father. Papy Gun did not speak. He picked his son up. He held him. 12 years later, on October 11th, 1957, Paul Irvin Gun, 58 years old, a licensed civilian pilot working as a charter operator in the Philippines, took off in a Beechcraft C-45 for a routine flight to Manila. A tropical storm intercepted him over the mountains of central Luzon. He was reported missing at 1745 local time. The wreckage of the aircraft was found by rescue crews the following morning. Gun was dead in the pilot's seat. The man who had built the weapon that liberated the Philippines had died on the same soil where his war had begun. That same year, the last B-25 Mitchell was retired from active United States Air Force service. The weapon and the man left the stage together. The Imperial Japanese Navy had already been gone for 12 years. After the war, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had signed the classified directive that pulled Japanese surface ships back from the Pacific, wrote in his memoirs about the shift that had taken place after Bismarck Sea. Japanese sea power in the Southwest Pacific, he acknowledged, had not been broken by battleships. It had not been broken by carriers. It had been broken by American medium bombers flying at wave-top height with their noses aflame. Because those bombers had destroyed Japan's ability to move by sea. And a nation of islands that cannot move by sea cannot survive.